I am not an actor. An actor craves the warmth of the spotlight, the validation of a rhythmic applause, and the visible connection with a living audience. My vocation demands the opposite, the absolute surrender of the self into the cold, silent void of anonymity. In the encrypted ledgers of the global elite, I am classified as a biostatic custodian, but in the dark, whispered reality of the trade, I am a sentry for the dead, a professional corpse. The industry exists because a billionaire's death is not an end, but a strategic liability. Before the body of a tycoon is even cold, the vultures descend. Rival corporations seeking genetic material for unauthorized bioauthentication, illegitimate heirs hunting for a drop of blood for DNA testing, and a predatory press that would pay a king's ransom for a single high-resolution image of a fallen titan's vacant stare. To prevent this, the family secures the real remains in a high-security cryogenic vault within minutes of the final breath. That is where I come in. I am the physical placeholder. The waxen effigy that occupies the casket during the public viewing, absorbing the prayers, the tears, and the hidden daggers of the mourners. I am the illusion of finality. For the Duvall contract, a job involving the patriarch of a dynasty built on blood and silicon, the standard operating manual had been replaced by a 50-page manifesto of biological suppression. I found myself in the cold room, a subterranean laboratory buried beneath the sprawling Duvall estate, where the air tasted of ozone and filtered nitrogen. I was stripped bare, standing on a frosted steel floor, while Mr. Reese, the lead technician, coated my skin with a translucent, thermally conductive polymer. Reese was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of gray marble. His movements were clinical, devoid of empathy. He spoke without looking at me, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to echo in the refrigerated silence. He reminded me that the Duvalls did not pay for performance, they paid for perfection. The compensation was astronomical, a sum that could buy a small island or erase a lifetime of debt. But the rules of static engagement were non-negotiable. "Recite Section 1, he commanded, his needle hovering over a vial of amber fluid. I closed my eyes, the freezing polymer tightening across my chest like a second suffocating skin. And I began to mentally trace the architecture of my own disappearance. Rule 1, thermal erasure. A corpse is a heat sink, not a radiator. I was required to undergo a grueling 60-minute immersion in a chemically treated ice bath, dropping my subcutaneous temperature to a consistent 27.5 degrees Celsius. The goal was to reach the cold threshold, where the human touch would detect only the chilling indifference of expired flesh. If a grieving daughter pressed her forehead against my hand, she must not feel the pulse of life. Sweat was a capital offense, a biological leak that shattered the illusion. To counter this, I was fitted with a subcutaneous Neuralink in my left palm. A single twitch of my thumb would trigger the coffin's internal heat exchangers, flooding the silk lining with a localized burst of liquid nitrogen to flash freeze any rising moisture. In the gold room, life was a contamination. Then came the injection. Reese plunged the needle into my brachial artery, delivering a high-potency dose of Stasis 7, a specialized neuromuscular paralytic. Rule 2, the block. The human body is a chaotic system of micro-expressions. The flutter of an eyelid, the involuntary swallow of saliva, the microscopic tremor of a muscle fiber reacting to a sudden noise. Stasis 7 eliminates these variables. It locks the muscular system into a state of rigid plastic deformation. My face became a mask of heavy porcelain. My jaw was welded shut. My tear ducts were chemically cauterized to prevent any leaking of living moisture, and my eyelids felt as though they had been cast in lead. I could not blink, even if a spider were to weave a web across my cornea. I could not swallow, even as the thick, metallic-tasting saliva began to pull at the base of my throat. Reese checked my pupils with a penlight, satisfied with the vacant, glassy stare reflecting back at him. "You look perfectly hollow, Matthias," he whispered, a compliment that felt like a burial. Roll 3 was the most grueling, the subterranean breath. To the public eye, the chest of the deceased must remain a motionless landscape of wool and silk. Traditional thoracic breathing was forbidden. I had been trained for months in diaphragmatic compression, a technique where the lungs are expanded downward into the abdominal cavity, shifting the internal organs with agonizing slowness. The rhythm was set to a glacial 3 cycles per minute. In the event of a proximity mourner, someone who lays their head directly onto the chest, I was expected to enter a state of total respiratory suspension. The Duvall contract demanded a 5-minute apnea window. If I lost consciousness from the lack of oxygen, the stasis 7 would ensure my body remained upright and rigid. The only failure was the gasping, violent recovery of breath. "The sarcophagus 4 is a pressurized environment," Reese reminded me as he helped me into a bespoke charcoal suit, the fabric infused with formaldehyde and lavender to mimic the scent of professional embalming. "The oxygen levels are managed, but the heat is your enemy. Stay cold, stay still, stay dead." I was lowered into the mahogany and titanium casket. The interior was a masterpiece of claustrophobia, lined with velvet that felt like dry moss. As the lid was partially closed, I was wheeled through the hushed corridors of the mansion toward the gold room. The psychological toll of the job is the transition from someone to something. You become a piece of high-value furniture with ears. People don't just mourn over you, they confess to you. They whisper the sins they couldn't speak to the living, assuming the ears in the casket are nothing more than biological receptors destined for the furnace. The first 2 hours were a blur of liturgical music and the rhythmic clicking of prayer beads. I maintained the glacial breath, my mind drifting into a meditative state. I was no longer Matthias. I was a prop in a high-stakes play of inheritance and image. Then the heavy doors of the gold room groaned open, and I smelled the sharp, acrid scent of expensive bourbon and stale smoke. Rogerio, the eldest Duvall son and the primary heir to the Silicon Empire, approached the casket. He didn't cry. He leaned over me, his face inches from mine. His breath was hot and smelling of rot. "You magnificent, greedy old parasite," he hissed. He didn't just touch my neck, he plunged his thumb into the soft tissue beneath my jaw, searching for the carotid artery with a brutal, digging pressure. He wasn't looking for life, he was confirming the kill. Rule 4. Passive endurance. The pain was sharp, a white-hot spike, radiating through my paralyzed neck. My heart rate began to climb, a dangerous biological signal. I felt the vibration of the monitor on my wrist, a silent warning that my internal systems were reacting. I used the void technique, imagining the pain as a distant sound in a different room. I was wood. I was wax. I was the silence between the notes. Rogerio squeezed until I heard the faint pop of a tendon, his eyes searching my frozen pupils for a single flicker of agony. I gave him nothing. Finally, he withdrew his hand, wiping it on a silk handkerchief as if he had touched something diseased. "Finally," he muttered, "the world is a little lighter." The hours crawled like insects across my paralyzed skin. The air inside the sarcophagus 4 grew heavy with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of my own suppressed panic. According to the protocol, the 4th hour was the visitation of the inner circle. This was when the true power players of the Duvall dynasty, the ones who didn't cry for the cameras, would come to ensure their secrets were buried with the flesh. I heard the soft click of high heels on the marble floor. It was the widow, Doña Constancia. Her presence was cold, even colder than the ice bath that had numbed my limbs. She did not lean in to kiss my forehead. Instead, she stood over me like a judge presiding over a condemned soul. "The world thinks death is a tragedy," she whispered, her voice a razor-thin blade of sound. "But for us, Matthias, and yes, I know your name, death is a grand cleaning of the ledger." I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew my name. Rule 5 of your manual, the one spoken only in whispers by Mr. Rice, was the refusal of food, involving the traditional gold coin. But as the widow reached into her black lace veil, she didn't produce a coin. She pulled out a small, obsidian-colored vial and a thin, translucent wafer. She pried my jaw open with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a woman of 90. The stasis 7 kept my mouth open, a dark cave waiting for its occupant. She placed the wafer on my tongue and tipped a single drop of the obsidian liquid onto it. The reaction was instantaneous. The wafer didn't just melt, it fused with my mucous membranes. I felt a chemical fire racing down my throat. It wasn't a poison that would stop my heart immediately. It was something far more sinister. It was a neurolock catalyst. It didn't just paralyze my muscles, it began to shut down my voluntary nervous system while keeping my sensory receptors hyperactive. I could feel every thread of the velvet lining, every vibration of the room, every degree of rising heat, but the connection to my lungs and heart was being severed. "Arthur didn't run away to the Caymans, Matthias," she said, leaning so close I could see the cracks in her heavy makeup. "Arthur is already in the furnace. We needed a body that could pass a medical inspection in the gold room, but we couldn't risk using a real corpse that might show signs of the struggle. We needed a living man to play a dead one, and then we needed that man to become a real corpse before the lid was sealed for the final time. You are the perfect sacrificial lamb. The agency didn't sell you your services, they sold your life." She stroked my cheek with a finger that felt like a dry bone. "The chemical on your tongue will induce a state of deep somatic arrest. To any doctor, you will be dead. To you, the next hour will be an eternity of vivid, agonizing consciousness. You will feel the fire. You will feel the wood crack. You will be the first person in history to witness his own cremation from the inside." Panic, hot and blinding, exploded in my mind. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were frozen in a chemical vice. I tried to trigger the nitrogen switch in my palm, but my fingers were no longer part of my body. I was a passenger in a suit of flesh that was rapidly becoming a cage. The heat was no longer a sensation. It was a physical weight. The velvet lining of the casket began to smolder, filling my nostrils with the scent of burning chemicals. I felt the first lick of real flame against the Italian wool of my suit. My skin, once kept at a perfect 27.5 degrees Celsius, began to blister, and as the fire finally breached my chest, the static became silence.